month. So this is the first one of these Petrovich lectures that I've actually been at the front of. I know this is a very long-standing and proud tradition, introduced, right, by my predecessor, Patricia Lanoux, to celebrate the first director of interdisciplinary studies. I'm just going to sit back and really enjoy this. I do want to say that this one, part of the beauty of it from my point of view is it's student-led from start to finish. And in this case it was Asta, INDS major, who came to us with a suggestion of somebody whose work she found fascinating and has taken this whole project from beginning to end. And I'm going to hand over to you to say thank yous to all the other people you corralled into helping us with this. So thank you, Asta. Thank you very much, Dr. LaFree.
Thanks. So first, if anybody's here with the class, there's the sign-in sheet here, so your professors can check and we know you came. So I want to thank everyone for coming out tonight. I'm Asta. I was the project manager for the INDS Council of Majors, and I was the coordinator for tonight's Petrovich lecture. And there's a lot of people that I need to acknowledge tonight, so bear with me. First, I'd like to thank the department for sponsoring the event. And next, the Council of Majors and the Petrovich team, including Mr. McAlpine. So if you could just raise your hand if I say your name. So that's Mr. McAlpine. I don't know if Melanie's in the room. Melanie Keys is not in the room. Is Joe Kennedy in the room? Okay, Joe helped out and Lillian speaks if she's in the room. Yeah, so thanks all you guys for helping bring this together. And we also have a long list of co-sponsors that helped make this possible tonight. Some of them include the Honors College, the Psychology Department, the Political Science Department, the Social Work Department, the Emergency Health Services. I'm trying to remember all of them. I think I got everybody. So thanks you all for coming out. And we'd like to thank Dr. LaFree for coming all the way from College Park in heavy traffic tonight. I made that commute when I was interning, and it's no fun, so we're glad you're here. And he's the director of the National Consortium for the Study of Terrorism and Responses to Terrorism, which is where I interned last semester. And I'm not going to take his thunder, but he's also a professor of Criminology and Criminal Justice at the University of Maryland, College Park. So thank you for being here, and you can take it away.
Okay, thanks so much. Thanks very much, Stephen, for the introduction as well. So it's a great pleasure to be here. I usually go straight past towards Baltimore, so it was nice to make a left turn. I've never been to UMBC. It's quite pretty out here, very nice. And my pleasure to be providing the 2014 Petrovich lecture as well, which I understand this event has been hosted since 1997 by the Interdisciplinary Studies program. And I know that a major goal of the lecture is to illustrate the need for addressing complex issues by drawing on various kinds of disciplines. And I think this description actually plays pretty well with the center that I direct, which is, as Asta just noted, the National Consortium for the Study of Terrorism and Responses to Terrorism, the START Center. I think most of us assume that in order to understand terrorism, that we're going to have to rely on methods, theories, techniques from a wide variety of disciplines. And I think this was really the thinking put forward by the U.S. Department of Homeland Security when they set up a Center of Excellence program about 10 years ago now. They eventually funded 12 centers, and they're very interdisciplinary. I just list these here. We were the fourth, we're called the START Center, we were the fourth funded. The first is out in California called CREATE, mostly economists. FASD, I was talking to somebody tonight, is at the University of Minnesota that studies, or University of Texas that studies zoonotic disease and foreign animal disease. The NCFPD at Minnesota studies food disease and so on. So you have a whole variety of them. We probably have the most social and behavioral scientists in the group. So our three biggest groups in the center are probably psychology, political science, and criminology. But we're very interdisciplinary. We work with pretty much geographers and historians and anthropologists and sociologists and computer specialists, mathematicians, engineers, very broad group. We're a consortium, so we've got projects at about 40 universities around the world. I think I've got a picture actually. And also, depending on a particular point in time, we've got projects in 10 or 12 different countries. Since we've been doing this research for now about 10 years, we have probably about 180 scientists that we work with over this period of time. And I'm going to talk mostly about one of the projects I've been most directly involved in tonight, but we have a bunch of other projects as well. And in fact, I've got my last slide, I've got some contact information. If you're at all interested, and you have your cell phone with us, you can take a picture at the very end. It'll put you on our listserv. We send out newsletters, events, information, and we'd certainly like to have you join that if you have an interest in this topic. So, the mission of our center, in a nutshell, is stated here: to advance knowledge about the human causes and consequences of terrorism. And that's what I'm going to be talking about tonight. But I think there was an advertisement. This is a copy. Yeah, so the advertisement says Black Swans and Burstiness. So in terms of black swans, you all know that we're not talking about the Natalie Portman movie tonight. Some of you may have seen. You may also not know why black swans can travel faster than other swans cross country. This would, of course, be because they can take the red eye. Anyway, it's probably good to start with a bit of levity, because my talk today is on a pretty serious and frankly somewhat controversial and often, in a way, depressing topic: terrorism. And in fact, academics and policymakers have long disagreed about exactly what this term means and how we define it. We were talking actually just before this talk about it, and it's quite complicated. Academics have whole conferences on how one goes about defining terrorism, and we can talk about that a bit in questions and answers if you want to. But when I talk about terrorism tonight, I'm generally referring to violence or the threat of violence by someone other than a government for a political purpose. So this definition excludes state terrorism, which is a very important, worthy topic, but not what I'm doing tonight. It excludes genocide, another topic that warrants its own treatment, but not what I'm going to be talking about for the most part. So anyway, the central theme of what I want to talk about tonight is that terrorism has two characteristics that make it especially prone to myth-making. The first of these I call its black swan nature, and the second, its bursty nature. The notion of terrorism as black swan I'm borrowing from essayist Nassim Taleb, who defines a black swan incident as one that falls outside the realm of regular expectations, has a high impact, and defies prediction. The term is actually based on the observation that before they visited Australia, Europeans had assumed that all swans were white, an assumption that was proven wrong in about 1692 when I think a Dutch explorer discovered black swans existed. Taleb claims that the coordinated attacks of 9/11 are a perfect example of a black swan event because they were unexpected, had a huge impact on history, and were difficult to predict. So the first characteristic of terrorism I want to talk about in a little more detail tonight is, and I think one of the major challenges in responding to terrorism, is that a handful of black swans, a handful of very rare cases, can have a disproportionate effect on setting the agenda for the phenomenon more generally, that we're disproportionately affected by these extremely extraordinary rare cases. But I also want to highlight a second characteristic of terrorism tonight, that it tends to be bursty. Stephen probably knows this term. Bursty distributions are those that are highly concentrated in time and space. And it turns out lots of things in life are bursty, including my trip up here. Crowded freeways tend to be bursty. Email messages tend to be bursty. Believe it or not, the frequency of forest fires tend to be bursty. You get a lot of them. When you start to get them, you tend to get a lot of them. And I'm going to argue that the global distribution of some types of terrorism also tends to be bursty. So what I want to argue is that these two qualities, the black swan nature of terrorism and its burstiness, are a large part of what makes it so challenging to the modern world. And what I mean by that, in a nutshell, is on the one hand, terrorism is relatively infrequent. It's hard to predict. But on the other hand, when it starts to happen, there's a tendency for it to happen in the same place a lot. So the main purpose of my talk today is to put these two general characteristics of terrorism into a broader context by looking not just at one or two exceptional cases like 9/11 or the attacks in Mumbai recently, but instead looking at every known terrorist attack in the world since 1970. And I feel, I have a lot of audacity to say that, every known terrorist attack in the world since 1970, and I should have audacity because it's a pretty difficult task to do this, I must say, after 10 years of working on it. In fact, on the day after 9/11, no such database existed. No one on the planet could tell us definitively how many terrorist attacks were happening worldwide or whether total attacks were increasing or declining over time. There were several event databases that approximated some notion of what terrorism was all about, but none of them included none of them tried to include all attacks, and especially important is they didn't include domestic attacks. I'm fond of saying that all science begins with counting things. If you think about it, the most elementary form of science is counting things, whether they're atoms, earthquakes, distance from the Earth to the Sun, or worldwide terrorist attacks. And it seems clear to me that we can't do a very good job of countering terrorism if we can't figure out how much of it there is, right? Imagine coming up with policies to reduce crime without knowing how much crime there is, or trying to reduce unemployment without knowing how much unemployment there is. But this stubborn fact has posed a central irony in our approach to global terrorism in the last half century. Because if ever there's an area where you'd like to have really good data, it would be terrorism, because it's all about, you know, this sort of subjective experience. And yet, for whatever reasons, I think terrorism research has lagged behind other areas in the social sciences. It's not been an area that's been particularly prominent until recently. My favorite quote on this comes from a British guy, Andrew Silke, who's a psychologist. He says, "Terrorism research exists on a diet of fast food, quick, cheap, ready to hand, and nutritionally dubious." Don't put this guy on your dissertation committee, I'd say. Now, he wrote this in 2003, so we could argue things have improved, and I think there actually has been a lot of work done in the area. But his point here is that this has not been an area where there's been a lot of really first-rate social science research in the past. And, you know, coming up with data on terrorism is challenging. It's also challenging to, if you think about it, we were just talking about this before the talk began, it's difficult to catalog anything. Like, my favorite example of this is that when, when William Shakespeare started writing Romeo and Juliet in the 1600s, he could not reach onto his bookshelf for an English language dictionary that would tell him whether a particular word he used was properly spelled or whether it was used in the right way, which is kind of amazing. You know, the guy's writing these great works, and there wasn't an English dictionary at this point in time. It hadn't been cataloged. It was much later that the English-speaking world developed a published reference word to catalog these things. And in a way, cataloging terrorism raises a lot of similar problems. How does one go about doing it? How does one go about categorizing every terrorist attack on the planet? Well, my background's in criminology, and in criminology, we generally get data on illegal behavior from three main sources. We either go to the police or some other official agent, we go to the victim, or we go to the offender. But all three of these sources have big problems if you want to study terrorism. Police departments and other criminal justice agencies collect vast amounts of data on everyday crimes in most countries, but this is rarely the case for terrorism. In fact, most countries don't even have a very consistent definition of terrorism. Part of the difficulty is that there are differing definitions, and even within the same country, different agencies can have different definitions. Also, a lot of terrorist acts cut across common criminal definitions. So terrorism might be a homicide, or it might be labeled as an arms violation, or other kind of criminal category. An assassination might be included in police data as a homicide, but not as terrorism. Destruction of property by detonating explosives might be in a police report as arson, but not as terrorism. To further complicate things, a large number of terrorist attacks have no identified offender, and even in those cases where an offender is identified, many of those suspected of terrorism are not legally processed for terrorism. So it's very difficult. There's, as far as I know, no really good official data on terrorism. It comes from police and the legal system. Talking to victims of terrorism is also of limited value, if you think about it. Terrorism victims have no direct contact with perpetrators much of the time. In many cases, they're chosen at random by their attackers, and in other cases, they're killed and they're not available to talk. Now, the third option that criminologists use is go to talk to past terrorists, talk to offenders. Most active terrorists, though, are not real happy to talk to researchers. And even if they're willing to participate, getting access to known terrorists raises some real serious challenges for middle-class researchers like myself, as indicated in this next slide, which shows two barbarians and a professor of barbarian studies, right? So you got the beard and the pipe and the tweed jacket. But you get the point. I mean, we don't really like to hang around with terrorists that much because they're pretty dangerous fellows. So, and I don't want to exaggerate that too much. We actually have quite a bit of useful research, I think, interviewing past people who have been engaged in terrorism in the past. But nonetheless, you're not going to be able to build an international database based on interviewing past offenders. So you end up with a situation where none of the sort of typical ways of studying terrorism are available to you as a scientist. However, there's some advantages in terrorism as a subject matter, because unlike most common criminals, terrorists are often actively seeking media attention. In fact, terrorists often see themselves as being unsuccessful if they don't get into the media. So a lot of people have pointed out that terrorism is often essentially political theater, that terrorist attacks can be carefully choreographed to attract maximum attention and to get into the international press. And in fact, the media are so central to contemporary terrorist groups that many researchers and policymakers argue that the birth of modern terrorism is directly linked to the launch by the United States of the first television satellite in 1968. And those of you who are interested in studying this know that, in fact, in 1968, the availability of satellite technology was immediately seized upon by a group. On July 22nd, 1968, 3 armed members of the Front for the Liberation of Palestine General Command hijacked an El Al commercial flight scheduled to fly from Rome to Tel Aviv. The hijackers diverted the El Al plane and its 48 occupants to Algeria, releasing some passengers but holding 5 Israeli passengers and 7 crew members hostage. The terrorists demanded the release of Palestinian guerrillas being held in Israeli prisons in exchange for these hostages, and the resulting negotiations were broadcast live around the world. And interestingly, I think in many ways this event made possible for the first time in modern history, or in history, the creation of the kind of event databases that I'm going to talk about tonight, because the events are getting reported and showing up in the international media. So the fact that terrorists are specifically seeking to attract attention through the media means that compared to media coverage of more common crimes, coverage of terrorism can tell us a lot more. So as a criminologist, I never think about studying burglary, let's say, by reading newspapers and looking at media accounts. But I think it's much more defensible to argue that you can study terrorism in this way. In fact, it's harder and harder to imagine that it's any longer possible for an aerial hijacking or a politically motivated assassination, even in remote parts of the world, to totally escape the attention of the global media. So what my colleagues and I set out to do after 9/11, and this was literally like 2 weeks after 9/11 when I got involved in this, was to develop a database on terrorism that would track every known attack around the world and would systematically code its major characteristics. Who committed the attack, what happened during the attack, where it happened, when it happened, and anything we could determine about why it happened. And over the past 10 years at the University of Maryland, we have developed such a database, which we call the Global Terrorism Database. And it's all open source online. You can take a look at it yourself. It's got a nice little kind of Google-esque search engine in it, so you can find out specific topics, et cetera, et cetera. We code about 120 variables for each of the 113,000 attacks that are in the database that happen everywhere on the planet going back to 1970. Here's what the database looked like originally. Talk about low tech. I mean, we have these yellow, we have them in, we still have them in the office, kind of in our museum section. Essentially, the database began with data collected by the Pinkerton Global Intelligence Service, which is a relative of the famous Scottish detective agency. Those of you know they used to be the group that would protect stagecoaches in the American West, for example. Anyway, PGIS trained researchers to identify and record terrorist attacks from wire services like Reuters, from US State Department reports, and from leading international newspapers like the New York Times and the British Financial Times. As time went on, PGIS researchers increasingly relied on the internet. Although the PGIS data collection changed somewhat over time, most of the items included were the same over the entire 28 years of data collection. We actually, when I got involved in this, we actually hired one of the, there were 2 main managers of this database over the 28 years. We hired one of them to help work with us to set up this new coding process that we were developing, and unfortunately the guy passed away a few years ago, but was very helpful in actually trying to help us reconstruct what Pinkerton had done. What was really original about these data, the main thing that separated them out from maybe 10 or 12 other databases like this, though, is Pinkerton collected not only international attacks, but domestic attacks, which ends up being hugely important because domestic attacks, we now know, outnumber international attacks by something like 10 to 1. And actually, that whole area is, I don't have a huge amount of time to go into it, but if you have questions about it, it's fascinating. It's actually harder to separate international from domestic cases than one might think. But what we mean by international is if three things match up. The nationality of the target, so the nationality of the country where the target is located, and the nationality of the group committing the attack. If all of those are the same, so a Greek group attacks a Greek target in Greece, we count that as domestic. Everything else we count as international. With the help of about 100 Maryland students, we finished computerizing the original PGIS data in 2005, and then since then we've had support from the Department of Homeland Security, and over the last few years from the U.S. State Department. We now supply the U.S. State Department with they're mandated by Congress to give an annual report on terrorism, and we supply the State Department with their unclassified data on terrorism now. So for the rest of my talk this evening, I want to use this database, the GTD, to put global terrorism into a broader context. And I'll do two things, really. I want to talk about, first, this black swan business I was talking about a moment ago. To say that if you look at not just one case, but 113,000 cases, you get a very different image of how terrorism has happened on the planet. And then I want to also bring in this notion of burstiness that I mentioned a moment ago. So let me begin on the black swan topic, and I'm going to discuss this by going through what I call myths of terrorism. I'll talk about 9 of these. And by myths, I mean myths in the everyday sense, that there are conclusions that are fictitious or unscientific. So let me just go through these 9 quickly. Myth number 1, terrorist attacks were rapidly increasing in the years leading up to 9/11. I think in the middle of 9/11 and the immediate aftermath of 9/11, there was just, we were overwhelmed with press coverage about terrorism, and we had a tendency to think there must be a heck of a lot of it out there and it must be really getting serious. If you look at the database, however, we get a much more complex picture. In fact, 9/11 was a pretty low period in terms of terrorism in the world. This is showing total attacks. The dashed line are fatal attacks, and the dotted line are what we could call mass casualty attacks, those that take more than 10 lives. Instead, what we see in terms of total attacks is a pretty steadily rising rate until about 1991, which I suspect is closely related to the collapse of the Soviet Union. And then we get a big depression and relatively low rates in here, and then a big increase again here. And I didn't bring the updated data. We're into 2013 now, and I'd have to go up to here. We actually have a lot of action in the last year. I think I've got a slide at the very end to tell you where that action is coming from. But my point is it's complicated. We actually were at a kind of a low ebb right before and right after 9/11. So contrary to a kind of common stereotype about terrorism, it doesn't look like there's support for it. Another idea is that terrorist attacks reach every corner of the world. And I think the ubiquity of modern communication systems means that individuals are now continuously bombarded by images of terrorist attacks from around the globe. And if I had a dollar for every time I've seen the iconic image of a fully loaded jet plane crashing into the World Trade Center, I'd probably be a lot wealthier than I am. This blanket media coverage leaves the impression that no location on the planet is safe from terrorism. But in fact, our analysis of the GTD indicates that terrorist attacks are highly concentrated in a relatively few places. For example, these are the top 10 countries in the database from 1970 to 2010. Colombia by itself has more than 7% of all attacks. If you throw in, you go up to the top 5, you're up to 32% of all attacks. And if you take the cumulative percentage of these countries, you got 2.4% of the countries of the world, 32% of the attacks. If you go up to 10, you got less than 5% of the countries of the world for almost 50% of all attacks in the database. I use countries as an example, but we find this is true on every single level. Terrorism is concentrated in regions, it's concentrated in countries, it's concentrated in cities, it's concentrated within parts of cities. Just like crime, basically.
Can I ask you a question about that slide?
Sure.
Northern Ireland, the Philippines, and Sri Lanka were countries where there were civil wars.
Mm-hmm.
How do you deal with the violence of civil wars as compared to terrorism, where it's really not a part of the civil war?
Well, the definition we're using excludes casualties that happen in war. So if it's casualties that are, if the area is officially at war and the targets are aimed at military targets, they're not included in the database. We have some exceptions to that. Like we include military targets if the targets are not at war, like the USS Cole case a while back. We include military if they're part of, like the Bali bombings where there were a lot of military personnel but they weren't the target. So we try to exclude those cases. And I'll say try because these databases are, like the biggest difficulty in these things is trying, in places like Iraq after 2003 or Afghanistan, where there's just a whole lot of violence going on and the press coverage may not be that great, it's really hard to tell collateral damage from other kinds of cases. I don't think the ones listed here are actually as much of a problem in that regard, though. If you look at the top 10 over the whole database, you don't get Afghanistan and Iraq. But yes, this is a problem, definitely. A challenge, let's say. Anyway, my point here is this. The 10% of the world's countries account for something like 75% of the world's terrorist attacks. And like my mother's always worried about where I'm traveling to, so I had a trip to India a while ago, and India is, comes in number 3 here. But all of the attacks in India, if you look at a map of India, they're all down by Sri Lanka. They're up in the far northeast corner or the far northwest corner. Most of India has had very few attacks. They're very concentrated. Myth number 3, the U.S. is more frequently targeted by terrorists than any other country in the world. And again, because there was so much media attention to 9/11, I think it led many observers, both in the United States and abroad, to assume that the U.S. is the target of an inordinate number of terrorist attacks. But again, how does this stand up when we actually look at the data? The United States ends up coming in as 14 in terms of most frequently attacked countries. It comes out as 17 in terms of most fatalities. And remember that almost 3,000 people lost their lives in the coordinated attacks of 9/11. If you take 9/11 out, the U.S. looks about like Greece or Canada. So not particularly likely to be attacked and not particularly likely to lose life in attacks. Myth number 4. Most terrorist attacks involve disgruntled groups and individuals from one country carrying out attacks on civilians in other countries. Again, the tremendous impact of 9/11 encourages us to think about terrorism as being mostly about unhappy individuals from one country attacking innocent civilians from another. And this was a question that no one could really look at very systematically because nobody had any domestic terrorism data until we got into the business. Here's what we found in a subset of these data, however. We took U.S. State Department reports that gave a list of the 52 most dangerous foreign terrorist groups, so outside the United States. And then we actually looked at what these groups were doing in terms of terrorism. And they were some pretty heavy hitters. They were responsible for over 15,000 attacks going back to 1970, over 35,000 deaths. However, their attacks were almost entirely domestic. And remember, I just said what this means. It's a very conservative definition of domestic. It means, for example, a Pakistani group attacking a Pakistani target in Pakistan. If any of those 3 vary, we count it as a domestic or as a transnational event. So only 7%, less than 7% of the attacks were transnational. And about the same, right around 7% of the deaths were transnational. So transnational terrorism is very rare, basically. Much more likely to be domestic. We were actually surprised by this too, that, and this is not a random sample of terrorist organizations. These are groups that the U.S. State Department says are especially interested in doing harm to the United States. But even these groups, for the most part, it's groups attacking their own citizens in their own country.